Tonight, you're not just falling asleep, you're beginning a journey, a quiet, moonlit walk through ancient paths. As the night deepens, let the sounds of forgotten millstones, fading oil lamps, and slow footsteps guide you through a world long gone. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these gentle stories from the past, tap subscribe, leave a soft comment, and share this with someone who needs rest tonight. Your quiet support helps keep this sleepy journey going. Now, close your eyes, slow your breathing, and come with me to a time when the wheel turned slowly and history whispered you to sleep. You might imagine Victorian medicine as a tidy row of bottles with precise labels, each substance neatly measured and its effects well understood. It wasn't. In reality, the medical cupboards of the 19th century were more like a blend of a kitchen pantry and an alchemist's bench filled with tinctures of uncertain strength, powders from distant lands, and recipes that drifted down from centuries before. Among these bottles, one stood out in both ubiquity and reputation. Laudanum.it was sold in small dark glass bottles, the liquid within the color of weak tea, with an aroma somewhere between strong alcohol and bitter herbs. Its name, laudanum, carried an old world weight, the echo of Latin, suggesting something dignified, perhaps even holy. In truth, it was opium dissolved in alcohol, often around 10% opium content, though the exact strength could vary wildly, and it was about to become the Victorian household's most trusted companion, from Paracelsus to the chemist's shelved. Origins of laudanum go back far before Queen Victoria ever sat on the throne. In the 16th century, the Swiss-German physician Paracelsus coined the name. His formula was not identical to the Victorian version. It contained opium, yes, but also saffron, cinnamon, and clove, all in a base of alcohol. He described it as a universal remedy, a stone of immortality in liquid form. By the 17th century, English physicians such as Thomas Sydenham refined the recipe into something closer to what Victorians would recognize: opium dissolved in wine or distilled spirits, sometimes flavored with spices. This simplified tincture proved easier to make and dose, and by the early 1800s, laudanum was not merely a medicine, it was a medical assumption. One did not ask whether to use it. One simply kept it in the home, the everyday bottline. Victorian Britain, laudanum could be bought from the local chemist without a prescription. This was no special arrangement for the wealthy. Anyone could walk in and buy it as easily as they might purchase tea or sugar. The price was low enough to make it a staple even in working-class households. It was sold under various brand names: Batley's sedative solution, Tinctura Opii, Godfrey's cordial, but whatever the name, the purpose was the same: pain relief, sleep, and general soothing. The cordial label in particular gave it a domestic air, as though it were simply a pleasant drink with added benefits. Laudanum was considered appropriate for nearly any ailment: a child with a cough, a teaspoon before bed; a mother with menstrual cramps, a tablespoon in warm water; a grandfather with arthritis, a daily dose to keep the stiffness away. Toothaches, diarrhea, indigestion, melancholy, neuralgia — there was always a reason to reach for the laudanum bottle, a medicine. For the emperor, it is difficult to overstate the reach of laudanum in the 19th century. Britain's empire was vast, stretching into climates and conditions utterly unlike its own. Soldiers in India took laudanum to combat dysentery. Colonists in Africa used it against fevers. Arctic explorers carried it for both pain and the mental toll of endless ice. Because it was portable, stable, and potent, laudanum became the empire's traveling physician. Wherever the Union Jack flew, laudanum followed. In literature and culture. By the mid-1800s, laudanum was more than a medicine, it had become part of Victorian culture itself. Writers and poets wrote about it with a mixture of awe and warning. Thomas de Quincey, in his famous Confessions of an English Opium Eater 1821, described both the euphoria and the suffering that came with habitual use. His accounts were romantic in their detail, almost hypnotic, and they helped fix laudanum in the public imagination as both a dangerous indulgence and an inevitable part of life. Even respectable women, who might never be seen in a public house, could use laudanum without scandal. It was discreet, taken at home, and often recommended by doctors themselves. In some ways, it gave the Victorians a socially acceptable way to be intoxicated. Strength and uncertain time. Modern readers might assume that Victorian medicine involved precise doses, but laudanum's potency varied dramatically from bottle to bottle. Some chemists diluted it, Others sold it strong to attract loyal customers. Without standardization, a teaspoon from one supplier might contain double or triple the morphine content of another. For the regular user, this meant a creeping risk. Tolerance built slowly, requiring more and more of the tincture to achieve the same relief. A small bottle that once lasted a month might, after a year, be gone in a week. The social dividend of laudanum was available to all classes. How it was used reflected social divisions. Among the working poor, Godfrey's cordial and other sweetened laudanum mixtures were given to soothe restless infants, allowing mothers to work long shifts in factories or laundries. In these cases, the drug was as much an economic necessity as a medical one. Without it, childcare and labor schedules would have been impossible to balance. In middle and upper class homes, laudanum was part of a personal health regimen. Ladies kept it in elegant glass decanters. Men carried small bottles in their coat pockets. It was even included in some travel kits, alongside shaving equipment and a flask of brandy. The unseen cost in the 1840s and 52nds, the growing use of laudanum, began to reveal its darker side. Reports of opium. Men and women who could not function without daily doses started to appear in medical journals. Babies dosed with soothing syrup sometimes failed to wake. Cases of overdose, intentional and accidental, were quietly recorded by coroners, though rarely publicized in newspapers for fear of scandal. And yet, even with these warnings, laudanum retained its place in the Victorian household. It was simply too useful, too familiar, and too trusted to abandon. The scene at the chemist stays. If you had stepped into a London chemist's shop in 1850, you might have seen the laudanum bottles lined neatly behind the counter. The chemist, often wearing a long white apron, would measure the liquid into smaller vials, sometimes adding flavorings, peppermint, aniseed to mask the bitterness. Transactions were brisk, friendly, and without any sense of danger. You might purchase laudanum alongside a tin of mustard powder or a bottle of castor oil. No warning labels, no locked cabinets, no questions asked, setting the stage for a dependency. The middle of the century, laudanum had achieved something rare in the history of drugs. It was both ordinary and essential. Unlike alcohol, it carried no stigma. Unlike more exotic drugs, it was affordable, and unlike purely local remedies, it was available in every corner of the empire. It was not yet understood that the soothing power of laudanum came at a cost, physically, socially, and eventually legally. That realization would come later, after decades of daily use and thousands of quiet addictions. Laudanum had arrived in the Victorian age as a gift from the past, a Renaissance tincture refined into a household necessity. By the 1850s, it was so woven into daily life that removing it seemed unthinkable. But if a single medicine could be so trusted, what would happen when that trust began to fray? Section 2. Dependence in the parlor. How Victorians lived on opiates. By the 1860s, laudanum was no longer simply a medical tool. It had become part of the Victorian rhythm of life. If you had stepped into a drawing room in those years, you might not have noticed it at first. It didn't announce itself like tobacco smoke or the smell of gin. Instead, laudanum lived quietly in small bottles, tucked discreetly into cabinets, handbags, and bedside drawers. It moved silently through the day, a few drops in tea before breakfast, a teaspoon after supper, perhaps a small nightcap before bed. It was as ordinary as butter on bread, yet it shaped lives in profound and often invisible ways. Morning doses and gentle starts. The Victorian morning began early, especially in urban households where the noise of carts and the call of hawkers started before sunrise. For those who had become accustomed to laudanum, mornings often began with a small measure to steady the nerves. This was particularly common among women of the middle and upper classes. The Victorian woman, bound by social expectations and domestic duties, often carried the burden of anxiety, sleeplessness, and physical pain, all of which laudanum promised to smooth away. Diaries of the era record women taking a cordial before sewing lessons with the children or before venturing out for the day's calls and visits. Men and the professional dose. For men in professional or administrative work, clerks, solicitors, merchants, laudanum offered a different kind of service. The working day was long, the work often monotonous, and headaches or digestive troubles were common. A measured spoonful from a desk drawer might take the edge off both discomfort and boredom, allowing concentration to return. In shipping offices, law firms, and railway administration buildings, small brown bottles sat discreetly among inkpots and ledgers. The private ritual like alcohol, which was consumed publicly in taverns and pubs, laudanum was most often taken in private. This was partly due to its preparation, it had to be measured and often mixed with another liquid, and partly due to its image. It was a medicine, not a recreational drink, and so its use carried a quiet dignity. In parlors, women would sometimes excuse themselves after tea, returning with a more relaxed expression, the faint bitterness of laudanum masked by the peppermint, water or port wine that delivered it. In bedrooms, bottles were kept within reach of the bed, ensuring that pain or insomnia could be answered without waking the household children, and the soothing syrup, one of the most troubling aspects of Victorian laudanum use was its administration to children. Many parents, often without malicious intent, dosed infants with preparations like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup or Godfrey's cordial. These products contained significant amounts of opium, and they worked as promised. The child stopped crying, slept soundly, and the household was calmer. For working class mothers who labored in factories, it was a grim but practical solution. With no one to watch the baby during long hours at the loom or the washtub, an opium-laced syrup could ensure the child would not cry unattended, but the cost was high. Medical records from industrial towns document cases of infants who failed to wake after heavy dosing. Coroners sometimes recorded the cause as debility or convulsions, careful not to directly accuse the mother, but the reality was clear. The medicine could be as deadly as it was effective. Tolerances and escalation for adults. The risk was less immediate but no less serious. Laudanum's effects dulled with repeated use, forcing the habitual taker to increase the dose over time. A woman who began with 10 drops before bed might, after a year, find herself taking a full teaspoon in the morning and another at night. A merchant who took laudanum for a toothache might find himself using it daily for general discomfort. The body, once accustomed to the drug, reacted sharply when it was withheld. Headaches, agitation, sweats, and deep unease set in. Writers and the creative dose. Some of the Victorian era's most famous literary figures were regular laudanum users. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, though from an earlier generation, had already set the example for using opium to enhance imagination. Victorian writers followed in his footsteps, often using laudanum to calm nervous exhaustion brought on by relentless deadlines. Wilkie Collins, author of The Woman in White, was known to take laudanum for chronic pain, and his diaries suggest that the drug shaped his sleep, mood, and even the pacing of his writing. The opiate haze could bring bursts of dreamlike imagery, but also long periods of lethargy and mental fog, public silence, private dependency in a society so concerned with appearances. Few openly discussed dependence on laudanum. It was framed as a necessary treatment, not an indulgence. A woman bedridden with nervous exhaustion could take laudanum daily without judgment. A gentleman with digestive troubles could maintain his doses without shame. Because of this framing, dependence was often invisible even to the person experiencing it. The relief was real, but so was the creeping need for more. The chemist, as confidant, the Victorian chemist often knew far more about a customer's health than the family doctor. Some customers came weekly, others twice a week, each time for another ounce or two of laudanum. The chemist, paid to sell, rarely questioned the habit unless signs of severe distress appeared. A few reform-minded chemists began to water down their laudanum or offer smaller bottles, but most sold what was asked for. After all, laudanum was legal, taxed, and widely advertised. It was not their role to interfere. The empire's quiet addiction. By the 1870s, laudanum dependence had become an unspoken thread running through Victorian life. It was in the homes of coal miners and factory workers, in the parlors of country rectories, in the writing rooms of poets, and in the campaign chests of colonial officers. It shaped moods, softened grief, dulled chronic pain, and blurred the edges of countless daily routines. It also created a population that, without quite realizing it, relied on an opium-based drug to function. Laudanum had not yet been seriously challenged by medicine or law. It was still the cure-all, the universal comforter, but some doctors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. If this medicine was truly so safe, why did so many patients need it for years on end? And what happened when they tried to stop? Section 3. Fading into law. The slow decline of an empire's favorite drug. By the 1880s, laudanum's reputation was still largely intact in the public mind. It was, to most Victorians, simply a reliable household remedy, no more suspicious than baking soda or linseed oil. Yet in certain corners of the medical profession, doubts were spreading. Doctors who had been prescribing laudanum for decades were beginning to notice patterns, patients whose chronic ailments never seemed to improve, who returned again and again not because the medicine had failed but because they could not function without it. Medical warnings began. The British Medical Journal and the Lancet began publishing cautious articles about the dangers of opium habituation. These reports rarely used the word addiction, a term not yet firmly in medical vocabulary, but they described symptoms that are unmistakable today: insomnia without the drug, severe stomach pains, tremors, anxiety, and mental depression. Some physicians noted that patients who took laudanum regularly seemed to age faster, lose weight, and develop a pale, drawn look. Still, there was no official guidance on limiting its use, and chemists continued to dispense it freely. Changing pharmaceutical science's late Victorian period brought advances in chemical analysis and drug refinement. By the 1870s, chemists could isolate morphine from opium with far greater purity than before. This made dosing potentially more precise, but it also allowed for stronger, faster acting preparations, ironically. This scientific progress fed the very problem reformers were beginning to worry about. Morphine injections could produce even swifter relief than laudanum, but with a higher risk of dependency. Social reformers take notice outside the medical community. Social reformers and temperance advocates began linking opium use to the broader issue of substance abuse. In industrial towns, where alcohol abuse was already a visible social problem, reformers pointed to laudanum as the hidden drink, a vice that crept through homes respectably, without the noise and violence of the public house. Some charity workers, particularly those involved in women's welfare, spoke openly about mothers who relied on Godfrey's cordial to keep children quiet. They argued that such dependence was a symptom of deeper social problems: long working hours, low wages, and inadequate childcare. The first restrictions in 1868, the Pharmacy Act, placed some control over the sale of certain poisons, including opium and its preparations. Laudanum could still be sold without prescription, but only by registered chemists, and records of sales were supposed to be kept. In practice, the act did little to curb availability. Customers who had long-standing relationships with their chemists found no barriers to purchase. But the law marked an important shift. For the first time, the British state had officially recognized opium as a substance requiring regulation. A slow cultural shift. By the 1890s, laudanum no longer had quite the untouchable reputation it once enjoyed. Doctors began prescribing it less often for routine ailments, turning instead to newer analgesics like phenacetin or aspirin. Among the middle classes, there was a growing awareness, fed by popular press stories, that opium could be dangerous. Some high-profile cases made the rounds: a respected clergyman found dead after an overdose, a well-known society hostess quietly sent to a rest home to take the waters after years of heavy laudanum use. Still, for many, the idea of a home without laudanum remained strange. Old habits died hard, and for chronic pain, insomnia, or digestive troubles, no alternative seemed as effective. The final blow, the real turning point, came with the early 20th century. After Queen Victoria's death in 1906, the United States passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, requiring accurate labeling of opium content, and British regulators took note. In 1916, during World War I, the Defense of the Realm Act further restricted the sale of opium and its derivatives, officially ending laudanum's reign as a casual over-the-counter medicine. By the 1920s, laudanum had been pushed to the margins of medicine. Morphine injections, codeine tablets, and newer synthetic drugs took its place in hospitals, while households turned to aspirin and non-opiate remedies. What was lost and what was gained? The disappearance of laudanum from everyday life removed a potent source of addiction and overdose. But it also marked the end of a certain kind of Victorian medical culture, one in which remedies were personal, portable, and often self-administered. To modern eyes, it is easy to see laudanum as reckless medicine, but for the Victorians it was part of a world in which self-care and professional medicine blurred together. It was the comforter in the sick room, the invisible aid in grief, the travel companion in distant colonies. An empire's quiet farewell. By the time laudanum faded from general use, it had been in British households for more than 2 centuries. Generations had been born, lived, and died with it in their cupboards. It had shaped literature, daily habits, and even the unspoken rhythms of social life. But its legacy was mixed, a reminder that medicine can heal and harm in the same breath. For the Victorians, laudanum was both the cure-all and, for many, the problem they could not name. Laudanum's decline was slow, almost reluctant, as though Britain itself had to wean from a trusted friend. The bottle on the shelf eventually disappeared, replaced by tablets in blister packs and neat instructions on printed labels. And yet, in reading the diaries, letters, and memoirs of the time, you can still hear the faint clink of glass in the parlor cabinet, the quiet pouring into a teacup, the long sigh of relief. If laudanum was the empire's most trusted medicine, what happened when other exotic substances began to arrive in London's chemist shops? Powders from South America, leaves from the Andes? Story to the coca leaf and the empire, from Andean tradition to London tonic. Section 1, Discovery and Transport. How coca crossed oceans. If you had walked into a London chemist shop in the 1870s, you might have noticed a new product sharing shelf space with the familiar bottles of laudanum and aromatic bitters. It came in small packets of dried leaves or in elegant glass bottles containing amber-colored liquid. The label might read Vin Mariani or simply Coca Tonic, and somewhere in the fine print you might see the words erythroxylon. Coca, a plant that had traveled thousands of miles to get here from the high valleys and mountain slopes of South America. It was not opium, and it was not alcohol, though it could be blended with both. This was coca, and to Victorian Britain it was both a curiosity and a promise. An ancient leaf. Long before the Victorians ever heard the word coca, the leaf was already ancient in its use. For centuries, some archaeologists say millennia, the indigenous peoples of the Andes had chewed coca leaves to combat fatigue, hunger, and the effects of high altitude. The practice was not a matter of intoxication. It was woven into daily survival in thin mountain air, where physical exertion demanded more than lungs alone could give. The leaves were chewed slowly, often with a small amount of lime from crushed seashells or plant ash to release their alkaloids. The taste was faintly bitter, the effect subtle, a steady lift in energy, a warming of the body, a sharpening of attention. European first encounters. Spanish conquistadors were among the first Europeans to see coca in use. At first, they regarded it with suspicion, associating it with indigenous religious rituals. But by the late 1500s, they recognized its practical value, especially for workers in silver mines. Like the colonial authorities even taxed coca as a revenue source, an early sign that European interest in the leaf would be shaped as much by economics as by curiosity. Still, coca remained largely confined to South America for centuries. It was bulky to transport, perishable if improperly dried, and its alkaloids were not yet understood or extracted. The science of the leaf turning point came in the mid-19th century when European chemistry began to advance rapidly. In 1855, the German chemist Friedrich Gedke succeeded in isolating the active alkaloid from coca leaves, naming it erythroxylon. A few years later, the more familiar term cocaine entered scientific vocabulary thanks to the work of Albert Niemann. These discoveries transformed coca from an ethnographic curiosity into a potential pharmaceutical commodity. A substance that could stimulate, relieve fatigue, and perhaps treat certain ailments, all without the heavy sedation of opium, was bound to attract the attention of Victorian medicine. Crossing the Atlantic by the 1860s, coca leaves and coca preparations began appearing in European ports, carried by steamships from Peru and Bolivia. Transport was not simple. Coca's potency declined quickly if the leaves were not carefully dried and packed. Merchants experimented with sealed tins, waxed paper, and later refrigeration during long voyages. Once in Europe, the leaves were either sold directly to consumers to be brewed as tea or chewed or used by chemists to produce tonics. Alcoholic infusions preserved the alkaloids better than dried storage, and this led to one of the most famous coca-based products of the 19th century, Vin Mariani. Vin Mariani, a Victorian sensation invented by the French chemist Angelo Mariani. In 1863, Vin Mariani was a blend of Bordeaux wine and coca leaf extract. The alcohol acted as both preservative and mild stimulant, enhancing the coca's effects. It was marketed as a restorative for fatigue, nervous exhaustion, and even melancholy. Mariani's advertising was elegant, featuring endorsements from European royalty, artists, and scientists. Queen Victoria herself was said to have received a complimentary case, though whether she drank it regularly is uncertain. In any case, Vin Mariani's reputation reached Britain quickly, and it became a fashionable tonic among the upper classes. British imitations. British manufacturers were quick to produce their own coca wines and tonics. Some were near copies of Vin Mariani. Others blended coca with additional stimulants like cola nut or quinine. These products were marketed not only as medicines, but as lifestyle enhancers ideal for travelers, businessmen, or anyone in need of sustained vitality. One popular London-made preparation claimed to be a defense against the languor of the English winter and a fortifier for ladies recovering from confinement. The wording was careful. Coca was not presented as a drug in the dangerous sense, but as a natural, almost exotic form of nourishment. Coca in the colonies, the British Empire's global reach gave coca a unique path to expansion. Missionaries and colonial officers posted to tropical climates sometimes carried coca preparations alongside quinine, using it to combat exhaustion during long treks or administrative work in the heat. In India, coca tonics found a small but loyal audience among Europeans working in the railways and civil service. In Africa, coca was occasionally used by explorers mapping interior regions, valued for its lightness and energy-giving properties compared to heavier rations. The allure of the modern stimulant in an age fascinated by progress, coca held a special appeal. It seemed to belong to both the ancient world and the new science. Here was a plant that had sustained Andean civilizations for centuries, now refined by European chemistry and placed neatly into bottles with printed labels. Unlike opium, coca did not dull the mind or slow the body. It promised clarity, productivity, and endurance to a society built on industry, empire, and constant expansion. These were virtues worth bottling. The seeds of a coming debate. Even in these early years, a few observers wondered whether coca might have its own hidden costs. Some physicians noted that patients who drank coca wine daily seemed restless without it. Others questioned whether the stimulating effects were too good to be entirely benign. But in the 1870s and early 1880s, such doubts were rare. For the most part, coca was celebrated as a gift of nature, a friendly import from a distant and romantic land. By the end of the century, coca had secured a place in the British pharmacopoeia and in fashionable society alike. But as chemists learned more about its active ingredient cocaine, the story would begin to shift, just as it had with laudanum. If coca was a stimulant without the perils of opium, what would happen when the stimulant itself was isolated, concentrated, and sold on its own? Section 2. From chemists to gentlemen. Coca in Victorian drinks and medicine. Acid is the quiet of an early London morning, sometime in the 1870s. The first carts are rattling over cobblestones carrying milk and fresh bread, and shop shutters are just beginning to creak open. In a narrow street near Covent Garden, a chemist's shop already has its door ajar, letting out a faint fragrance of camphor, lavender oil. And something more unusual, on a shelf behind the counter, in a row of carefully labeled apothecary jars rests a small container marked simply Coca Peruvian. For the average Victorian gentleman or lady, this was not a strange sight. By this time, coca had found its way into the very heart of respectable British society, not as a mysterious Andean leaf to be chewed in the sunlit mountains, but as an ingredient in powders, tonics, and cordials. It was not yet cocaine in the modern illicit sense. Rather, it was the refined extract, or sometimes simply the powdered leaf, blended with other botanicals and sold as a tonic for mind, body, and spirit. The apothecaries promise Victorian chemists were master advertisers. In the window, a colorful printed card might declare, "For weariness of body and melancholy of mind, a few drops will restore vigor and cheer." Coca tonics were presented as something both exotic and trustworthy. Exotic, because they came from far off Peru and carried the mystery of Inca tradition. Trustworthy, because they were dispensed in neatly measured doses by men in white aprons, under the watchful gaze of Latin labeled jars and brass scales polished to a mirror shine. One popular preparation was Vin Mariani, a French invention, blending coca leaf with Bordeaux wine. Advertisements claimed it restored appetite, improved digestion, and banished fatigue. In Britain, local equivalents quickly appeared: coca cordial, Bolivian leaf tonic, and Anglo-Peruvian elixir lined shop shelves. The ingredients were sometimes genuine. Other times, the coca content was little more than a pinch, added for the right to print the word on the label. An aid for the overworked. In Victorian London, the pace of life could be relentless. Clerks hunched over ledgers from dawn until the gas lamps flickered on. Factory managers strode through noisy floors with the constant rattle of machines in their ears. Even the ladies of the drawing room faced their own exhausting rounds of social calls, charity committees, and endless correspondence. Coca products were marketed as a relief for this modern weariness. A few spoonfuls in the morning promised to clear the fog of the head. A sip before a speech or a committee meeting could strengthen the voice and enliven the mind. Writers and journalists swore it helped them through long nights of deadline work, their hands stained with ink, their minds kept alert by this South American leaf. The gentleman's flask, while coca was often taken at home or in the office, it also slipped quietly into the gentleman's world of travel and leisure. Small silver-topped bottles of coca cordial were tucked into traveling cases alongside shaving kits and pocket watches on railway journeys from London to Edinburgh. A discreet sip could keep one bright-eyed through the rolling green landscapes. Explorers preparing for expeditions into Africa or Asia sometimes carried coca extract as part of their medical chest, believing it could ward off fatigue, hunger, and even fever. One celebrated mountaineer of the era wrote in his diary that coca wine gave the limbs a spring even after the most weary ascent. It was, he said, a draught of sunshine from the Andes, bottled for the Englishman's comfort. In the parlor and the drawing room, though coca products were pitched to the practical-minded, they also became a feature of polite society. Ladies served coca-infused cordials at small afternoon gatherings, presenting them as a fashionable novelty from abroad. It was not considered improper after all. It came in elegant glassware, not a suspicious paper packet. Guests sipped, murmured polite approval, and perhaps found themselves just a little more talkative as the evening went on. The upper classes liked to think of themselves as connoisseurs of the global empire's offerings. Tea from India, coffee from Ceylon, chocolate from the Caribbean, and now coca from the Andes. Each was a thread in the great tapestry of trade that the Victorians believed both sustained and justified their empire. Medical endorsements, doctors of the period at least some added their voices to coca's chorus of praise. Articles in medical journals described its ability to calm the nerves without dulling the intellect, to fortify the constitution against the encroachments of disease. A few went further, recommending it as a treatment for morphine, addiction, nervous exhaustion, or even seasickness. Yet, like so many Victorian miracle cures, coca was embraced more for anecdote than for proof. Few clinical trials existed. Most evidence came from individual cases, travelers' accounts, and the enthusiasm of manufacturers. The seeds of concern even as coca enjoyed its fashionable moment, a few cautious voices began to note that in concentrated forms it might produce effects too strong to be entirely benign. These were often dismissed as overreaction. After all, tea and coffee had faced similar doubts in earlier centuries, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted and they would grow in the decades ahead. For now, however, coca remained a darling of the chemist trade, a touch of the exotic for the weary city dweller, a bottled promise that one might feel for a moment the crisp air and bright sun of distant mountains. Section 3. The turning of the tide, regulation and retreat of coca production. The last decades of the Victorian era, the empire's long and casual romance with coca began to cool. What had once been sold with cheerful endorsements in every chemist's window now found itself under a growing shadow of suspicion. The change did not happen overnight. It was a slow, reluctant unwinding of habits and profits, shaped by new scientific knowledge, a rising awareness of addiction, and a public health movement that was learning to speak more loudly than the merchants. The first murmurs of concern be the 1880s. Medical journals that had once praised coca for its invigorating powers began printing case reports of troubling side effects. These were often couched in cautious language. The Victorians disliked alarmism unless it came from the pulpit, but they spoke of patients who had developed nervous irritability, tremors of the hands, or a dependence upon the daily draught. In plain terms, some could not function without their coca wine or coca lozenges. One famous example came in 1886 when Dr. Thomas Lauder Brunton, a respected physician, wrote in the Lancet that coca, while useful in short doses, had a tendency to exert too constant a stimulation upon the nerves, such that the natural rest of the body is delayed, with eventual exhaustion of the system. This was not yet the language of prohibition, but it was the opening note of a new tune. The science sharpens at the same time. Advances in chemistry were changing the conversation. When cocaine, the alkaloid at the heart of coca leaves, was isolated and studied in purer forms, researchers found that its effects were far stronger than those of the leaf in its natural state. What Andean farmers had chewed for centuries without widespread harm became, in its distilled Victorian form, a powerful stimulant with a clear potential for misuse. By the late 1880s, laboratories in Germany, Britain, and the United States were experimenting with concentrated cocaine for medical purposes, as an anesthetic, as a remedy for nervous depression, and even as a cure for morphine addiction. While some of these experiments brought genuine innovations, especially in surgery, they also drew attention to the drug's more troubling qualities. The medical profession, increasingly concerned with precision and safety, began to view coca not as a harmless tonic, but as a substance requiring caution. Public cases and the pressed Victorian press played its own part in shifting opinion. Newspapers, always hungry for stories of scandal and excess, began reporting on the coca fiend, a figure lifted partly from reality and partly from sensational imagination. This was often a middle or upper class person, once respectable, now drawn into ruin by the daily habit of coca wine or powders. The tone was moralistic but also tinged with fascination. The same publications that scolded readers for indulgence were still carrying advertisements for coca products just a few pages later. One notable case, reported in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1892, involved a young barrister who was said to consume a bottle of coca wine a day to maintain his workload during the busy legal season. When his health collapsed, the article framed it as both a cautionary tale and a curiosity. Such is the peril of unexamined vigor, that the draught which lifts one in the morning may betray one before the year is done. Shifting commercial strategists, Manu stressed, sensing the change in public mood, began to adapt. Some reduced the concentration of coca in their wines and tonics, replacing it with other herbal ingredients and quietly dropping the word coca from their labels. Others doubled down on exoticism, leaning into imagery of the Andes and the ancient Incan tradition, presenting coca as a noble leaf misunderstood by meddlesome reformers. The most famous example of this adaptation came from Vin Mariani, the French coca wine that had once been celebrated by royalty, scientists, and even the Pope. By the 1890s, Vin Mariani advertisements still appeared, but they emphasized moderate use and hinted at the product being suitable for seasonal occasions rather than daily consumption. The Victorian art of understatement was in full play. Manufacturers were not admitting to a problem, but they were gently steering consumers away from habits that might now seem questionable. The role of temperance and regulation, broader temperance movement, which had already taken aim at alcohol, found in coca and cocaine a new target. While the movement's leaders often lacked a precise scientific understanding of the drug, they recognized that it could be grouped with other unnatural stimulants, undermining the moral and physical health of the population. By the turn of the century, municipal authorities in Britain were considering the regulation of cocaine sales. In 1901, the Home Office issued guidance that chemists should avoid selling concentrated cocaine preparations without a doctor's prescription. This was not yet law, but it marked the beginning of a formal framework that would eventually draw coca products out of the casual marketplace. The cultural retreat. By the Edwardian era, coca had lost much of its Victorian glamour. It still had its defenders, and some of its milder forms persisted in pharmacies, but it was no longer the fashionable tonic of choice for London's tired clerks or overstretched society ladies. The association had shifted from modern vitality to outdated quirk, and in the public mind it was increasingly linked to the shadowy, dangerous side of the city's underworld. As regulations tightened and public taste moved on, coca's presence in Britain faded into a kind of half-memory. It remained in medical practice, carefully measured, but its place in everyday life was gone. The empire, which had once delighted in bottling and selling the vigor of distant mountains, had turned the page, a sleepy reflection on the quiet hindsight of history. The Victorian love affair with coca seems almost innocent, though it was anything but. It was part of an era's boundless curiosity and its equally boundless willingness to experiment on itself. Coca's rise and retreat tell the familiar story of a society learning slowly, reluctantly, that not every imported wonder is a harmless gift. By the time the last bottles of coca wine were cleared from chemist windows, the empire had moved on to new stimulants and new excitements. The leaves that had once crossed oceans now stayed mostly where they had grown for centuries, high in the Andean air, far from the restless streets of London. Story 3: Chloroform and the Art of Gentle Sleep. Section 1. The first painless surgery chloroform enters the operating theatre. It was the winter of 1847 when the peculiar sweet scent of a new liquid first drifted through the corridors of Edinburgh's Royal Infirmary. It was faint, almost floral, but with a strange metallic edge like lilacs blooming near a forge. Doctors, nurses, and even the patients themselves could not help but turn their heads when the bottle was opened. Inside was a clear, unassuming fluid with a long and unmusical name, chloroform. At that time, surgery was still a brutal affair. The operating theatre was a place of speed, not comfort. Surgeons prided themselves on how quickly they could saw through a limb or stitch a wound, for speed was the only mercy they could offer. Pain was expected, even celebrated as a mark of bravery. To be conscious through the slicing of flesh and the scraping of bone was the grim reality of the age. But change was stirring. Across the Atlantic, ether, another sweet-smelling gas, had begun to make waves. In Boston, a dentist named William Morton had demonstrated its use for painless tooth extraction in 1846, and word spread like wildfire. Yet ether was clumsy. It irritated the lungs, caused coughing fits, and its open flames in crowded theaters made it dangerous. Surgeons were curious but cautious. Enter James Young Simpson, a Scottish obstetrician with a reputation for bold experimentation. Simpson was not content to accept pain as the inevitable companion of medicine. In his dining room one evening, surrounded by friends and students, he began testing various chemicals to see if any might work better than ether. The group sniffed and inhaled from bottles, laughing at their lightheadedness until someone uncorked a small vial of chloroform. Within minutes, the company had slid gently into unconsciousness, their wine glasses still in hand. They awoke on the floor, startled but unharmed. Simpson knew at once this was something extraordinary. Here was a substance that worked faster than ether, required less to induce unconsciousness, and left no violent coughing in its wake. The sleep it brought was smooth and deep, as if one had simply stepped sideways into a dream. The first patient to receive chloroform in surgery was a young woman undergoing the removal of a tumor. She was pale, frightened, and bracing herself for agony. Simpson soaked a folded cloth in chloroform and held it gently over her mouth and nose. Her breathing slowed. Her eyelids fluttered, and then silence, no scream, no flinch. The surgeon worked with deliberate care, unhurried for the first time in his career. When the woman awoke, she blinked in confusion and asked when the operation would begin. It was already over. The medical world was astonished. Newspapers printed breathless accounts of painless surgery. The public was equally captivated. For the first time, the scalpel no longer had to mean agony. Hospitals began to request bottles of chloroform, and chemists, sensing a profitable market, were quick to supply it. Even Queen Victoria would later request it during the birth of her eighth child, giving it the royal seal of approval. Yet in those first weeks there was also unease. Doctors worried about safety. Chloroform was powerful, perhaps too powerful. A drop too much could slow the heart dangerously. There were whispers of sudden deaths on the operating table. But for now, in that chilly Edinburgh winter, the promise of pain-free surgery shone brighter than the fear. And so, chloroform stepped into the theatre, not the velvet curtain stage of actors and applause, but the tiled and blood-slicked stage of 19th century medicine, and the world of healing would never be quite the same again. Section 2. From hospitals to parlors, recreational use, and social curiosity. The mid-19th century, the word chloroform had drifted far beyond the boundaries of the operating theater. At first, it was a whisper in the corridors of hospitals, an odd-sounding name that patients repeated nervously while waiting their turn for the surgeon's knife. But in a remarkably short time it became a conversation piece in drawing rooms, a curiosity in the parlors of the wealthy, and even, in certain cases, a mild scandal whispered behind fans and newspaper columns. The Victorians, for all their stern manners and moral codes, had an unquenchable appetite for novelty. And chloroform, with its promise of banishing pain in a cloud of fragrant vapor, was exactly the sort of marvel that would be discussed over tea. Ladies who would never dream of setting foot in a hospital might still find themselves leaning forward in fascination as a guest recounted their experience of being under. They imagined it, the cool cloth pressed to the face, the sweet, strangely heavy scent, the sense of floating, then the sudden, startling awareness that it was all over and the pain gone. One cannot quite overstate how modern chloroform seemed. To those first decades after its discovery, it was a time when science was beginning to enter the home in unexpected ways. Gas lighting, once a miracle, was becoming commonplace. Telegraph wires carried news faster than a galloping horse. And now there was this a chemical trick that could pluck a person from agony and drop them into a dream without even the faintest memory of what had happened in between. It did not take long for this marvel to become an object of social experiment. Physicians were sometimes invited discreetly to private homes, not to tend to illness, but to administer a demonstration. A lady of the house might request to have the sensation in the presence of close friends. Guests would watch, half in awe and half in alarm, as she breathed deeply and her eyelids fluttered shut. In some cases, the room would hold its breath until she stirred again, blinking in mild confusion, as though she had just awoken from a summer nap. For others, chloroform was not merely a demonstration, but a peculiar form of amusement. A small number of fashionable young men, often the same sort who attended mesmerist shows or collected exotic curios, began to treat it as a parlor entertainment. In dimly lit rooms heavy with cigar smoke and the sound of clinking glasses, the chloroform bottle would be passed round like a rare liqueur. One could take a few deep breaths and sink into a blissful haze, waking to laughter and gentle teasing. The newspapers did not entirely approve. The Illustrated London News carried editorials warning of injudicious domestic application and hinting darkly that young people might be courting danger. Yet such warnings seemed only to add to the air of mystery. Chloroform was unlike anything the general public had experienced before. Opium, laudanum, and brandy were well known, their pleasures and perils understood. But chloroform, invisible, quick, and strangely clean, belonged to a new world. In certain artistic circles, the substance acquired an almost poetic reputation. Painters spoke of the vivid half dreams they experienced while under visions of light and color they could not capture on canvas. A few writers, though rarely admitting it in print, claimed that a minute or two of chloroform could free the mind from its usual constraints, allowing for sudden bursts of imagery or inspiration. Of course, for every such romantic tale, there were also murmurs of less graceful episodes of guests who awoke confused, stumbling, or unwell. It was inevitably the boundary between medical science and personal pleasure that began to trouble the authorities. Chloroform had been invented for surgery, for mercy in moments of pain, not as an evening diversion. Still, in those first decades, there was no strict law against a private citizen keeping a small bottle in the cabinet, just as one might keep a decanter of sherry or a box of patent pills. And so, quietly, it became a hidden feature of certain Victorian homes. A host might, with a conspiratorial smile, produce it for a trusted friend. It was the very secrecy that lent it allure. To drift into a painless, floating darkness at will in a century so full of moral restraint was to taste something almost forbidden. In time, of course, the dangers would become more widely understood, but in this early period, chloroform occupied a strange, in-between place in the public mind, half scientific miracle, half exotic amusement. The hospitals still needed it, the surgeons still praised it, but in the parlors of the wealthy, it had already begun a second life. As a social curiosity, a whispered indulgence, and for some, a memory as vivid as any dream. Section 3: Risks, Regulation, and the Long Fade into his story. In the soft hush of the later 19th century, when gas lamps still glowed on street corners and the slow club of carriage wheels echoed on cobblestones, chloroform was already passing from novelty into something more complicated, a subject of caution. The little glass bottles that had once been greeted with wonder were now handled with a measure of care. They still promised sleep, still promised a merciful escape from the knife's edge of surgery, but whispers had begun to circulate about the price that might sometimes be paid for that blessing. Doctors who in earlier years had embraced the substance with almost childlike enthusiasm were starting to take notes, detailed, measured, and at times uneasy notes on its unpredictable effects. The newspapers, too, had begun to record the rare but unsettling stories of patients who, instead of waking refreshed after an operation, did not wake at all. In an age when the line between scientific marvel and public alarm was thin, such accounts traveled quickly, carried along by rumor, by tavern conversation, and by the cautious warnings of the medical press. The risks, it seemed, were not entirely in the hands of the surgeon. Chloroform's power lay in its ability to slow the breath, to still the anxious heart, and yet in that very stillness there was danger. For some, the heart slowed too much. For others, the breath simply would not return. Medical journals Printed cases in clinical, almost detached prose, but between the lines one could sense the growing unease. Here was a gift that could turn, without warning, into a quiet thief. Governments began to take notice, though not always with speed. In Britain, the matter was discussed in committee rooms lined with dark wood and heavy curtains, where senior physicians and officials debated how or even if regulation might be needed. Across the Atlantic, American cities and states considered similar questions, though laws were often slow to follow. In the absence of strict control, much depended on the judgment of individual practitioners and on the public's own appetite for risk. By the early decades of the 20th century, chloroform's reign as the queen of anesthetics was already waning. New agents, such as ether's safer variations and later, more modern compounds, began to take its place. These alternatives were less capricious, less likely to turn a routine procedure into tragedy. Hospitals that had once kept rows of chloroform bottles began ordering fewer and fewer. The glass vials, once polished and displayed as part of the surgeon's proud equipment, were quietly put away into drawers or left to gather dust on forgotten shelves. The fade was not abrupt. Rather, it was like the dimming of a lamp at the close of a long evening. For decades, chloroform lingered in smaller towns, in countries where new drugs were slow to arrive, and in the private practice of older physicians who trusted their own hands and methods. Yet even there the old excitement was gone. Where once it had been the herald of pain-free miracles, it was now a tool handled with measured caution, and with an awareness of its place in a broader history. By mid-century, chloroform was as much a memory as a medicine. Medical students still learned of it, but in lectures framed by words like historical importance and early development of anesthesia. The glass-stoppered bottles could be found in museum cases, their labels faded, their contents long since evaporated. Visitors would pause before them, reading the placards in quiet tones, as if standing before the relic of some vanished age. In drawing rooms and old letters, the stories still surfaced, a grandfather recalling the moment when the sweet, cool scent filled his lungs before a surgery in his youth, or a faded diary entry from a nurse describing the delicate art of holding the soaked cloth over a patient's face. These recollections carried both the marvel and the shadow, the gratitude for the pain spared, and the knowledge of what was risked in the process. Thus chloroform drifted into history not with a scandal, nor with sudden prohibition, but with the slow acceptance that its time had passed. Like so many wonders of the Victorian age, it was a bridge between eras, from the crude agony of pre-anesthetic surgery to the carefully controlled, near painless procedures of the modern theater. And in that bridge lay its true legacy, a reminder that progress is rarely a straight road, but rather a winding path through discovery, triumph, caution, and eventually replacement. In the quiet of the present day, when a patient drifts into a controlled and safe sleep before an operation, there is no scent of chloroform, no soaked cloth, no ticking worry in the surgeon's mind. Yet in some small unspoken way, each moment of painless surgery carries a shadow of that old chemicals promise, and a whisper of the era when sleep came in a bottle, sweet and swift, and just a little too close to forever. Story for the curious case of the Victorian ice stratisection 1. From New England ponds to the tropics, the great ice harvest. The winter mornings in New England had a particular kind of stillness in the early 1800s. The air was so crisp it seemed to chime faintly when you moved, and the ponds and lakes, once restless with summer ripples, lay locked in smooth, glassy silence beneath several inches of ice. It was in this setting that a new and rather improbable industry began to take shape. Men bundled in wool coats and felt hats would gather along the frozen edges, their breath turning into little clouds in the pale dawn light, preparing for a harvest unlike any other, the harvest of ice. The leader in this strange trade was a man named Frederick Tudor, later to be known as the Ice King. He was not a fisherman or a farmer, but rather a merchant with a peculiar vision, sending frozen water from New England's winter all the way to the sun-baked plantations of the Caribbean, and eventually as far as the sweltering ports of Calcutta. The idea at first seemed nearly absurd. How could ice survive a journey of weeks or even months in the holds of wooden sailing ships? And more importantly, who would pay for it? The method of harvesting ice was almost as methodical as the growing of wheat. When the ice on a pond reached the right thickness, often a foot or more, crews would take to the surface with long, sharp-toothed saws. The work was steady, almost hypnotic. The slow scrape of the saw cutting rectangular blocks from the frozen sheet, the rhythmic thunk as each slab was pried loose and slid into the channel of dark water that snaked through the ice field. Horses, shuffling patiently in the cold, would pull the floating blocks toward a wooden chute leading up to the shore, where they were stacked like giant glass bricks in storage barns insulated with sawdust. This sawdust was the secret to Tudor's success. It kept the ice astonishingly well through the spring thaw, through the humid grip of summer, and even through the journey across oceans. Packed tightly in the dim belly of a ship, the blocks might lose a fraction of their mass to melting, but enough would remain to astonish customers in distant climates. Imagine in 1833 an Indian nobleman in Calcutta lifting a drink chilled with ice from a pond in Massachusetts, an indulgence so improbable it bordered on magic. In New England towns, the ice harvest became a winter ritual. Farmers whose fields lay dormant under snow could earn extra income by joining the crews. There was camaraderie in the work stories traded across the ice, the warmth of coffee sipped from tin mugs during brief pauses, the crunch of boots on frost. And at night the barns glowed faintly from lantern light as the stacking continued, each block handled with care, as if storing away a treasure that would not be seen again until it emerged in a place where winter never came. Yet, for all its novelty, the trade depended on a fragile balance of nature and logistics. A mild winter could mean thinner ice, smaller harvests, and a tighter profit margin. A ship delayed by storms might arrive with more meltwater than ice, but Tudor persisted, refining his packing methods, expanding his customer base, and persuading hotel owners, restaurateurs, and wealthy households that they needed chilled drinks, preserved foods, and even ice cream in a world that had never known such luxuries. By the middle of the century, the ice trade was no longer a curiosity, it was a sprawling enterprise, stretching from the quiet ponds of New England to the bustling docks of Havana, New Orleans, Rio de Janeiro, and Bombay. The very idea that a New England winter could be exported, neatly cut and packed, had transformed from a merchant's eccentric dream into an everyday reality for thousands of people, and yet, for all its reach, the ice trade still began each year in the same way, with the slow forming of ice under a gray winter sky, the careful testing of its thickness, and the quiet, patient labor of men and horses on a frozen pond. It was a business built on cold, but carried out with a certain warmth, a rhythm of work and rest that mirrored the seasons themselves. Section 3: Decline and the Rise of Mechanical Refrigeration in the same slow, dreamy, sleepy history tone. The end of the ice trade did not come suddenly, like a ship struck by a storm and lost to the sea overnight. Rather, it faded gradually, as though the once vital blocks of frozen water were melting not just in the heat of summer, but in the march of progress itself. By the late 19th century, whispers of new technology had begun to drift through the parlors and counting rooms of merchants. Mechanical ice-making machines, at first large, clumsy contraptions that wheezed and clanked like steam locomotives, began to appear in urban centers. Their inventors promised a future where one needn't wait for the chill of January to stock the ice house, nor rely on the uncertain yields of pond harvests vulnerable to warm winters. Ice, they claimed, could be made at will in any season, in any place. For the ice merchants of Boston, Maine, and Norway, these claims must have sounded both absurd and quietly threatening. After all, for decades they had built a commercial empire on the rhythm of nature, on the hard freezes that locked the ponds each winter, on the patient labor of sawmen with their horse-drawn sledges, on the clink of chisels cutting perfect cubes for shipment abroad. But as the machines improved, absurdity turned to inevitability. In the cities of the American South, hotels and restaurants embraced mechanical refrigeration with a certain giddy practicality. It meant no more dependence on shipments delayed by storms, no more panicked days when the ice houses ran low before the next delivery. Instead, they could produce their own supply, clear, clean, and constant. The change was not without resistance. In newspapers of the era, one occasionally finds letters from readers claiming that machine-made ice lacked the healthful freshness of natural pond ice. Some went further, insisting that artificial ice was tinged with chemicals or carried a flavor faintly metallic. Yet such protests could not hold back the tide. By the early 20th century, rail cars once laden with glistening blocks from Maine found fewer and fewer buyers. The great ships that had carried ice to Calcutta and Havana took on other cargoes. In England, the familiar sight of the iceman's cart rumbling along cobblestone streets became a rarity. replaced by the quiet hum of refrigeration units in basements and kitchens. Even the grand ice houses, those architectural curiosities of stone and brick, half buried to keep their interiors cool, slipped into obsolescence. Some became storage sheds. Others, abandoned, were slowly reclaimed by ivy and moss. In a few country estates, the ice house lingered as a quaint relic, a talking point for Sunday guests strolling the grounds. We used to keep the ice here, you know, an elderly gentleman might remark, tapping the cool stone wall with his walking stick before the machines came. For all its romance and seasonal poetry, the natural ice trade could not compete with the technology that offered convenience and certainty. And so, what had once been an international marvel, the shipping of winter itself across oceans, became a footnote in the ledger of history. Yet, even as the industry dissolved, the cultural memory of it remained in the quiet nostalgia of certain New England towns. Winter still brought a brief echo of the old harvest. Children skated over the frozen ponds where their great grandfathers had once cut ice, and in the sharp January air one could almost imagine the sound of saws and the shouts of men hauling blocks onto sledges. Mechanical refrigeration had won the future, but the ice trade had left its mark. It had brought cool relief to the tropics, transformed dining habits, and proved that even something as fleeting as frozen water could be turned into a commodity of global commerce. And though the last great ice shipments melted away more than a century ago, their story remains preserved, if not in ice, then in memory. Story 5: The Clockwork Banquets of the Belle Poque. Section 1: Dining as a Precision Performance in the glittering decades of the Belle Poque between the 1870s and the outbreak of the First World War, dining particularly in the grand hotels and private salons of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg was not merely a matter of eating. It was instead a carefully choreographed event, a performance in which timing, movement, and etiquette worked in harmonious concert, as if every guest, every servant, and every plate were part of a great ticking machine. Guests would arrive at a specified hour, often 7 or 8 in the evening, but the true start of the evening was not announced by a gong or a call, but by the quiet unison of footmen opening doors to the dining hall. Long tables gleamed under gaslight or early electric chandeliers, their surfaces dressed in starched linen that had been pressed with almost mathematical precision. Silverware was laid in an exact order, with every fork and spoon equidistant from its neighbor, as though a surveyor had measured them. Once seated, guests did not speak over one another. Conversation moved in waves, subtly timed to the service of each course. The waiters silent, swift, and as precise as the turning of a clock's gear would move in synchronized lines, delivering dishes with the handle of the lid always facing a certain direction so the diner could lift it without awkwardness. The courses themselves were paced with remarkable care. A soup might be enjoyed for exactly 12 minutes before being replaced with the fish course. The fish, in turn, would yield to an at precisely the right moment, neither rushed nor delayed. Those who worked behind the scenes, the maître d'hôtel, the head chef, the sommelier, treated the evening as a conductor might a symphony, ensuring that nothing jarred the rhythm. This attention to timing was not purely about elegance, it reflected a philosophy of the age that society, like a fine watch, functioned best when all its parts were in order. Story 5: The Clockwork Banquets of the Belle Poque. Section 1: Dining as a Precision Performance in the glittering decades of the Belle Poque between the 1870s and the outbreak of the First World War, dining particularly in the grand hotels and private salons of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg was not merely a matter of eating. It was instead a carefully choreographed event, a performance in which timing, movement, and etiquette worked in harmonious concert, as if every guest, every servant, and every plate were part of a great ticking machine. Guests would arrive at a specified hour, often 7 or 8 in the evening, but the true start of the evening was not announced by a gong or a call, but by the quiet unison of footmen opening doors to the dining hall. Long tables gleamed under gaslight or early electric chandeliers, their surfaces dressed in starched linen that had been pressed with almost mathematical precision. Silverware was laid in an exact order, with every fork and spoon equidistant from its neighbor, as though a surveyor had measured them. Once seated, guests did not speak over one another. Conversation moved in waves, subtly timed to the service of each course. The waiters silent, swift, and as precise as the turning of a clock's gear would move in synchronized lines, delivering dishes with the handle of the lid always facing a certain direction so the diner could lift it without awkwardness. The courses themselves were paced with remarkable care. A soup might be enjoyed for exactly 12 minutes before being replaced with the fish course. The fish, in turn, would yield to an at precisely the right moment, neither rushed nor delayed, those who worked behind the scenes, the mater, to tell the head chef, the sommelier treated the evening as a conductor might a symphony, ensuring that nothing jarred the rhythm. This attention to timing was not purely about elegance, it reflected a philosophy of the age that society, like a fine watch, functioned best when all its parts were in order. Section 2. Kitchens like clock factories. Beneath the calm elegance of the dining room, the kitchens were another world entirely a place of controlled chaos, made orderly by the same relentless precision. These kitchens, especially in the grand hotels of the Belle Epoque, operated more like engineering workshops than simple places for cooking. The Brigade de Cuisine system, perfected by the legendary Auguste Escoffier, divided the kitchen in two specialized stations: the saucier for sauces, the poissonnier for fish, the tisser for roasts, and so on. Each cook station functioned like a cog in the larger mechanism. Timing was everything. If the fish was ready too soon, it would lose its delicate texture. If the roast lagged behind, the entire sequence would collapse. Orders were called out in a rapid, almost musical chant, and every hand moved according to the beat. Pots clanged, knives chopped, steam hissed, but underneath the noise there was a steady rhythm, a tempo dictated by the master chef. Some observers remarked that the sight of a Belle Epoque kitchen in full operation was like watching the inner workings of an enormous clock, all gears meshing perfectly, even the service of wine was timed to the second. The sommelier knew exactly when a bottle should be opened so that it would reach the table with the bouquet at its peak. Champagne was chilled to an exact degree, and port was poured with the slow, unbroken stream of an experienced hand. For the diners above, the result was seamless, almost invisible. But for the staff below, it was a nightly performance of discipline, skill, and timing, repeated with the same reliability as the striking of a clock. Section 3. The gentle decline of a perfectly timed world. Like all great performances, the clockwork banquets of the Belle Epoque could not last forever. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 brought an end to the stability, luxury, and leisurely pace that had allowed such precision to flourish. The great hotels remained, but the elaborate multi-course meals began to fade. Wartime shortages made certain ingredients rare or unavailable. Servant staffs shrank as young men went to the front and women took on new roles outside the home. The strict formalities of the pre-war table began to seem old-fashioned in a world now marked by speed, uncertainty, and change. After the war, the 1920s introduced a new kind of dining: shorter meals, lighter menus, jazz instead of waltzes, and a more relaxed pace. Restaurants adapted, offering fewer courses and simpler service. The old synchrony of 20 waiters moving in perfect unison was replaced by a brisker, more casual style. The intricate machinery of the Belle Epoque banquet was slowly dismantled, piece by piece, until it was only a memory. Yet in some corners of the world, perhaps in an old Paris hotel dining room, where the chandeliers still cast their soft glow over polished silver, echoes of that perfect timing linger. If one listens closely, one might almost hear it: the soft shuffle of synchronized footsteps, the gentle clink of perfectly aligned cutlery, the heartbeat of a world that once believed life could be as graceful and exact as the ticking of a clock. Story 6. Gaslight Dreams. The Soft Glow of a Bygone City. Section 1. A city awash in amber light. The first gas lamps began to glow in London in the early 1800s, their soft amber light spilling across cobblestone streets like warm honey. Before this, night in the city was a patchwork of darkness, broken only by flickering tallow candles, smoky oil lamps, or the pale glow of the moon. Gaslight changed everything, not in a sudden burst, but in a slow, steady tide, like the incoming sea on a quiet night. The earliest gaslights were curious contraptions: iron posts capped with glass lanterns, each fed by an invisible network of underground pipes. At dusk, lamplighters in tall hats would walk their rounds, pole in hand, to coax each lamp into life. The hiss and pop of ignition became a familiar sound, a kind of evening heartbeat for the city. Shops lingered open a little longer, theaters gleamed more brightly, and for the first time an ordinary evening stroll could be taken without fear of vanishing into blackness. But the glow was more than light, it was atmosphere. Gaslight had a texture thick and golden, with shadows that pulled softly instead of cutting sharply. Under it, bricks seemed warmer, windows more inviting, and the faces of passers by gentler somehow. In this new world of illumination, the night was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be savored. Section 2, Life by Lamplight. The presence of gaslight reshaped the rhythm of life. Taverns and coffee houses filled with customers deep into the night. Booksellers kept their doors open for the evening reader. Tailors could finish a suit without relying on daylight. Gaslight allowed the hours to stretch, to bend, to spill over their old boundaries. Theaters, in particular, bloomed in this artificial twilight. Playhouses glowed like beacons, drawing carriages and foot traffic alike. Gaslight could be dimmed and brightened, creating mood and drama for the stage in ways candles never could. The smell of gas, faint but distinct, mingled with the perfume of powdered wigs and the rustle of silk dresses in the audience. Even domestic life changed. In parlors and drawing rooms, smaller gas lamps replaced the crude, smoky oil lamps. Families read aloud in the evenings, needlework could be done without straining the eyes, and card games continued until yawns finally signaled bedtime. For the wealthy, the soft hiss of the gas mantle became part of the home's comfort. As ordinary as the ticking of a clock, there were darker sides too. Poorer neighborhoods did not enjoy the same brightness. Gas lamps might be sparse, and the shadows between them thick and deep. The gas itself, though invisible in the pipes, could be dangerous if leaked, a fact that some unfortunate households learned the hard way. But even so, gaslight brought a sense of security to places that had once been cloaked in complete darkness. Section 3, the slow fade into electric light. For decades, gaslight reigned as the queen of the night, but change, like the slow dimming of a lamp at dawn, was inevitable. By the late 19th century, whispers of a new light, electric light, began to spread. It promised brilliance without flame, illumination without the faint whiff of gas. The first electric arc lamps blazed like small suns, far too harsh for parlors, but perfect for grand avenues. Cities began to experiment, gas lamps still lined. Side streets still welcomed lamplighters each dusk, but in the main squares a new, whiter glow appeared. People marveled, but some complained. Electric light was too clean, too sharp, it lacked the romance, the softness, the shadows of gas. Lovers of the old ways found themselves defending a light that felt alive, that flickered and breathed, against one that burned with cold precision. The decline was slow. In some cities, gaslight lingered into the early 20th century, cherished for its beauty even as practicality favored the electric bulb. Eventually, the lamplighters vanished from their rounds. The underground pipes were abandoned or repurposed, and the amber glow that had transformed cities into warm nightscapes became a memory. Today, gaslight survives in pockets in preserved historic districts, in restored lanterns flickering outside old taverns, in films that recreate a Victorian street. When it burns, it feels like a whisper from another age, a reminder of evenings when the world slowed down and the city bathed in light that was not just illumination, but poetry. Story 7, Ether, the party trick that stopped hearts. Section 1. From surgery to soiree, Ether's unexpected career. It began not in a ballroom or a dusty theater, but in the sharp brightness of a surgical chamber. The year was 1846, and in the austere, echoing halls of Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital, Dr. William T. G. Morton stood ready to change the practice of surgery forever. In his hand was a glass inhaler, and within it a strange, sweet-smelling vapor, sulfuric ether. It was meant, quite simply, to dull pain. The demonstration was a marvel. A tumor was removed, the patient's body relaxed, their face composed. In an age when surgery had been an ordeal of screams, sweat, and straps, this calm was almost unthinkable. News spread quickly, crossing oceans in dispatches and letters. Pain could be banished. Ether was hailed as a miracle, but as with so many marvels of science, the human appetite for novelty soon bent it toward other purposes. What was first a solemn medical tool began, in certain circles, to be something else entirely. Physicians brought it home to show friends how it worked. Students, always eager to impress, passed around soaked cloths at gatherings. Before long, ether found its way out of the operating theater and into the drawing room. It was not unlike the way electricity, once the domain of laboratories, became a parlor amusement with static generating machines and shocks passed from hand to hand. Here the shock was not in the fingertips, but in the mind, a giddy, floating sensation, as if one had momentarily stepped outside the ordinary rhythm of life. And for some Victorians, especially those with a taste for the unusual, this was a pleasure worth seeking out. Section 2. Victorian daredevils, ether parties, and public spectacle. Ether parties were curious affairs. Imagine a quiet sitting room, the heavy drapes drawn against the gaslight outside, a small group of people in evening dress leaning forward in anticipation. A decanter, not of brandy but of a clear, pungent liquid, sat on the table beside folded cloths. Someone, often a medical student, would pour, drench the fabric, and hold it out. The first breath was always sharp, the vapors rushing in like an unexpected wind. Eyes would widen, voices would lift in surprise. Then came the laughter uncontrollable, spilling into giggles and half-finished sentences. People spoke nonsense, sang little fragments of songs, or simply stared dreamily into the middle distance. The more daring tried to walk, wobbling across the carpet as if the floor were swaying. Underfoot, there were public spectacles too. Traveling entertainers offered ether frolics, inviting volunteers from the audience to inhale on stage. A lucky few staggered about in comic disarray, their hats slipping, their gait uncertain, to the amusement of the crowd in those moments. Ether was not a medical advancement, it was a novelty, a trick, a shared joke between performer and spectator. Yet beneath the laughter there was a certain risk that most did not fully appreciate. Too much ether, inhaled too deeply, could still the breathing, hearts could falter. But in the dim, perfumed air of a drawing room, such thoughts were far away. The thrill was in the moment, and in the telling of it afterward. Section 3, the last. Laugh decline in the face of regulation. Ether's career as a party amusement was always destined to be brief. By the late 19th century, medical authorities and governments began to take note of its hazards. Reports trickled in of accidents of those who inhaled too much too quickly and never woke again. Newspapers, which once printed playful accounts of ether frolics, now carried cautionary tales. Other substances, newer and easier to handle, began to supplant it in medicine. Chloroform, despite its own dangers, became fashionable in operating theaters, and later, nitrous oxide, the so-called laughing gas, found a safer niche in dentistry. Ether, with its sharp odor and unpredictability, seemed a relic of an earlier, wilder moment. By the early 20th century, ether parties were little more than a curiosity remembered by aging doctors and adventurous grandfathers. The gaslights in drawing rooms gave way to electric bulbs, and the world turned its amusements elsewhere. But for a brief span in Victorian times, there had been evenings when the most daring entertainment was to close one's eyes, breathe deep, and let the mind drift into a strange, sweet oblivion while friends laughed and the room swayed as if reality itself had grown unsteady. And so ether passed from the realm of mirth back into the sober hands of surgeons, leaving behind the faintest ghost of laughter in the footnotes of history.